Today I'm going to talk about the problem of evil in the world. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So I just want to clarify in the beginning that I'm going to talk about the practical problem of evil, not the philosophical problem of evil. The practical problem is much, much harder. The philosophical problem of evil is really very straightforward. I've made videos about this. I'll link at least one of them in the description. Remind me if I forget. And the TLDW is, roughly speaking, that God permits evil in order to bring about greater good. And evil, being a privation of good, is not a positive thing, that you can weigh it against. And so, basically, the short form is that the only way to argue against this is to know what would actually create maximum goodness, which would require you to have the sort of knowledge of God, or at the level God does, which no human being has, so you can't actually coherently argue to it. It's not the philosophical problem that interests me. That's frankly just not much of a problem. The practical problem, that's a really big problem, because evil is really, really hard to deal with. And evils, both moral and natural evils, the difficulties, the challenges, all the things that go bad, all the things that people do wrong, there is an awful lot that is wrong in the world. Things seem to get worse all the time. And so it's that. How do you live with that? How do you deal with that? That's the thing that I want to talk about today. That's the much, much harder problem. Although intellectually, in some sense, it's by faith. So, you live by faith. I want to say, I mean that in the Catholic sense, not the Protestant sense. This isn't you live by faith, as in there's this thing called capital F faith that has no discernible properties, etc. I mean faith in the sense of, you know that God is good and you trust in that, so you live according to that trust. That said, that's the super short abbreviated version that I greatly doubt will do anybody any good for hearing it. Just want to let you know, basically. Okay, so in terms of how to deal with it, the basic... I'll get to my autobiographical aspect at some point, perhaps. It's not all that important, of how it was I sort of came to learn to deal with evil in the world. But the basic structure is that I've found myself is that the way you deal with evil in the world is by first realizing how much evil there is in the world, that it is much, much worse than you probably realize. One probably realizes. I'm American. I say you for one. Not you personally. Anyway, that is to a great degree the first step. And you can see this, basically there are 3 stages to this process, which correspond, roughly speaking, to the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, and the crucifixion of Jesus. And so I'll take them, roughly speaking, in order. So the book of Ecclesiastes is interesting because it talks about how awful things are. And it almost ends. There are a few paragraphs afterwards, but it sort of comes to its conclusion. It focuses its point down to that famous line, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Now, vanity in this case meaning things that are empty, that have no actual effect and no significance. This is basically the same sort of idea as in when Macbeth complains that I have to start. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays light the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So that description about how life is meaningless and pointless by Macbeth. Same basic idea. All of the things that human beings trying to accomplish, they fail at. Everything they do comes to nothing in the end. The world is a temporary place in which nothing lasts, in which we don't know what's going on, we don't understand what's going on, and not knowing any of this, we can't accomplish anything. So everything we do has effects, but not the ones we intend. It's all futile in that sense. And so that's vanity of vanities. All is vanity. The original is, I believe, had something, it was sort of like, another way you can translate it a little bit more literally, as I understand it, is like, it's all wind. There's the thing that passes, but has no substance. However, that's not quite the end of Ecclesiastes. If you read on, there are a few things. Generally, it's arranged into three paragraphs. The paragraphs are kind of more modern structure than would be in the original. But anyway, as it tends to get arranged now, the final paragraph, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So Ecclesiastes basically talks about how, like, as far as we can see, everything is terrible. And then, basically, the conclusion is, so what the hell are you going to do? Forget it all. Don't worry about it. Just obey God, and, that will work. And, God sees for... That last line, God will bring everything to judgment, that which is, secret, that which is secret, even good or evil, is saying essentially, God can see further than we can, so we can't see any purpose to anything, but that's okay, because God can see further than us, so just, trust, and there you go. Well, that is it's a very practical answer, and that is in some sense a beginning. It is by no means the end of the question, but it's very workable. And if you've ever actually been doing practical things where you needed to achieve something, it does basically describe how a lot of these things go, where you can see all of the problems and you don't know how it's going to work out, and then you kind of get to, okay, well, what the hell are you going to do? I can't see all this. I just have to go try. And then you go try, and sometimes you succeed and sometimes you fail. But anytime you succeed, you always have to, before you succeed, put down all of the worrying and all of the considerations of all the things that can go bad and all the stuff where you can't see how it's going to work out, and just go do it. And that is, to some degree, to a great degree, the answer in the book of Ecclesiastes. Is it's all terrible, but that's only as far as we can see. So stop worrying and just, put your head down and get to work. And that's the practical solution. Okay. Not a satisfying philosophical answer in the slightest, but it is in practice how you actually manage to get anything done in this world. Now, the next sort of step in the process is what I describe as what you see in the book of Job. And by the way, G.K. Chesterton's introduction to the book of Job is, personally, I think it's the best thing he ever wrote. And if I don't link it, please remind me to put it in the description. It is phenomenal. And as Chesterton points out, basically, now the book of Job is fairly long and it's very good, and I am just touching on it. I am not in any sense claiming to, be adequately summarizing it or anything even close to that. And there's a reason why Chesterton's essay was an introduction to it. It's telling you what there is good that you can go get out of it. In the sense of like, okay, now go and do it for real to like really get it. Now, so the thing about it is, roughly speaking, so Job is the best of men, and God permits Satan to afflict Job with all sorts of things, and his sons are killed, and his cattle and camels are slaughtered, and so on. And then Job falls sick and ill, and eventually, sort of at the end, he's in a just sitting on an ash heap as the dogs lick his open sores. And he refuses throughout to curse God, and there are people who come and comfort him and offer all sorts of theories as to why God is permitting this suffering for Job. The comforters of Job. And Job says basically to all of them, no, that's obviously wrong. And so, and then finally Job does call out and ask God for an explanation. And then God comes in a tempest, in the form of a tempest, and gives Job an explanation. And it's really interesting. God asks, who is this who has been muddling things with his empty-headed words? And then there's a great line, now gird your loins, for it is my turn to ask questions, or for me to ask questions and you to answer them. And so in this, Job And then God starts asking questions of Job. Interestingly, he doesn't give answers to Job. Job has been asking, various questions, and what God does is ask some more questions. And he asks some really big ones, asking him things like, "Where were you?" Well, he starts off. I'm sorry, I'll get to that. The one I was about to say in a second. But he starts off with things like, okay, so where does like this animal lay its eggs, and where does that animal rear its young, and where's this one go? All things Job has absolutely no way of knowing, because Job can't go, flying up to where birds are deep into the ocean or what have you. But then he gets to things like, and at the beginning of time, where were I forget the exact question, but essentially asking about stuff that happened at the beginning of time. Said, were you there? You must be very old by now. And God's essential point, summarizing it within the book of Job, is roughly that, to even summarize how this goes, Job essentially, and this is not a substitute for reading it, Job essentially says, I don't get how suffering fits into the world. And God points out to Job, well, you don't get the world either. You don't get how anything in the world fits into the world. So there's no contradiction that you don't understand suffering either. There's no problem here that you don't understand suffering, because you don't understand any of it. So it all, in some sense, fits together in that it all works together. And Job thinks about it and essentially concludes, yeah, that's true. And he repents of having called out in the way that he did, because it's true. He doesn't understand anything, so it fits that he doesn't understand this too. And then God praises Job, and specifically, very, very interestingly, goes and tells Job, he goes and tells the comforters of Job, the ones who defended God, who explained God's ways, essentially, and told them to ask Job to pray for them, lest God, to essentially lest God's wrath fall upon them for having, essentially, said such stupid things about God. And the things they said were not like, I'm painting with very broad strokes, very imprecisely. But the things they said often, are things that you will hear frequently these days too. So when I say stupid, I don't mean like actually stupid. I just mean that they are reductive. They are attempting to explain the ways of God as if man can really fully understand the ways of God. And in particular, to understand the ends towards which God is working. And this is the problem, we can't. Because the ends towards which God is working are incredibly incredibly numerous. So, a thing I do, I happen to have like a pen knife. So here's a tiny little pocket knife that I use for opening packages and stuff. I just dropped it. What are the effects of that? Well, it made a sound, it was on the video and so on, but it moved the air. Okay, and that's about as far as I can see. But the fact that it did these things have effects. The mere fact I can't imagine what goes on next doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means I have no idea what comes next. And the fact that this is on a video and so on, I have no idea who will see this and how it will affect them and what they will think of. And then multiply this down through the generations as people talk to other people, have children, make decisions based upon things where they have no clue that it even was influenced by something. I can't even begin to imagine this, but God can imagine all of this. God can see all of this present in his eternity outside of time. And so the ends towards which God is working are so much more numerous than we can possibly comprehend. So that is a big part of why it is to say that the ways of God are mysterious to us. It's because the things that God is balancing and coordinating and working out are so much more numerous than we can possibly even begin to imagine. That it's not that God is illogical, but rather that God's logic entails so many premises and so many arguments we can't see even most of this. And so I'm using arguments stuff metaphorically here, but so the point of that is the world is very big and we can't fit it in our heads, but it does certainly fit in God's head. And so we live in trust because we don't understand all of the manifold, multitude of goods that God is working towards and all of the things that will balance out. And by the way, Job, in the end, then received even more wealth than he had beforehand, and he had many children and so on. He was blessed with material things even greater than he was before he lost all of them. And so the workings of God are mysterious to us because they are so much bigger and more complex than we can possibly understand, because they encompass so much more, and they encompass not just people, but animals and particles of dust and absolutely everything. And it is a very normal fallen human thing to say, like, well, I can't think of that, so it doesn't matter. But that doesn't follow. The mere fact that you can't imagine it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. The mere fact that you can't imagine even all the people who are currently alive, let alone the generations yet to come, doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It just means that, like, your thinking is worthless on this subject because you can't even begin to do that thinking. So that's the book of Job. The book of Job, roughly speaking, is the next part, which is the beginning of the philosophical answer of why is suffering permitted, and to bring about good. How? We don't know how any good is ever brought about, so we don't know how suffering works into this, just like we don't know how anything else works into this either. And it is true that we have, a great deal larger ability to visit places and track things down, although it's still the case that people don't know where blue whales go to have their offspring. Maybe someday people will find that out and won't change a darn thing about that. But the point is, like, that's not the point. It was just convenient facts that people don't know that are brought up, but there are always a multitude of facts that we don't know that can be brought up. And if you want to access simple ones, just think about how much you don't know. Pick any random human being and think about how much you don't know about that human being. But God knows and is working towards their good. Think of all the times when you yourself are sad about something or happy about something and don't tell anybody. It's going to be most of the times that you're happy or sad. Well, God knows about them all, but other people don't. So you don't need to go into things about the wild ass or, where the vulture lays its eggs or what have you. You can go and find those things out if you want, but there are a multitude of things you don't know. There are more species than you can possibly even hope to know. And the person next door is more complicated than you can ever actually hope to know. Most people can't even know themselves very well. Most people find themselves quite mysterious and can't remember things that they themselves have done and can't figure out, often they're sad but can't figure out why, or feeling pretty good and don't really know why. The amount that we know about this world is so very, 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 very limited, but it all actually matters to the truth, and so we can't get at that, and so we must live our life in trust. And since we don't know how good actually works, we don't know how suffering fits into it, but that's, philosophically speaking, okay. Now, that is very useful, and it gets you further than the answer in Ecclesiastes of just put your head down and get to work. Even so, it only gets you so far. Now, next we come to the answer of Jesus, and this is where things really become far more satisfying. And I mean, the answer is still you have to live in faith, because that's fundamentally what you have to do. Like, unless you can know everything, you have to live in trust. It's impossible to not have to live in trust unless you can know all the relevant things. And you obviously can't know all the relevant things, so the only thing open is living in trust. But this explains a lot more. And so, there are two things that I want to talk about. One is the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Wheat and the tares is its older name. And one is the crucifixion. And so I'll get to the wheat and the tares in a moment. The thing about the crucifixion, as has been pointed out, I want to say this is from Scripture, but I've seen it quoted and paraphrased in a variety of ways too, which is the author of life took on flesh and came and visited us, and we killed him. God came and walked amongst us, doing miracles constantly, healing the sick and doing things like multiplying loaves and fish tremendously, gathering, feeding giant crowds and being followed by people because of this, being a miracle worker who cured all sorts of things, who drove out demons. God worked miracles constantly as he walked amongst us, and our response was to kill him. It's bad. However bad you think society is, it's worse. We are really, 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 really bad. Human beings are terrible because our response to God coming into the world is to kill him. Now, not literally everyone, of course, and this actually brings me to the parable of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds, to use more modern terminology, which is that there is a landowner whose servants went and slaves, in use modern term, or to use that term, whose slaves went and planted seed in this field. And at night, while everyone was sleeping, an enemy came and sowed weed seeds in amongst them. And then when things germinated, the wheat came up, and so did the weeds. And the slaves went to the master and said, "Where did these weeds come from? Didn't you sow good seed?" And the master said, "Yes, some enemy must have done this and planted weeds." And so the slave said, "Well, do you want us to go and pull up the weeds?" And the master said, "No. If you pull up the weeds, you may pull up the wheat with them. Let the two of them grow together, and then at harvest time, I will send the harvestman out to first bind up the weeds, pull the weeds, bind them up, and burn them, and then afterwards come through and collect the wheat." Now, this is one of the few parables where we even have the explanation, because they asked him just to be really darn sure, and where the landowner is is God, and the slaves are the angels, and the wheat are human being. The seeds are human being. The wheat seeds were the children of heaven, and the weed seeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy is the devil. Now, this, by the way, ties in that it's a fascinating thing. When Jesus was before Pilate, Jesus said to Pilate in response to a question, "For this I came into the world. For this I was born, for this I came into the world, and for this I was born, to testify to the truth, and those who are of the truth hear my voice." And that's the thing that Pilate famously replied, "Truth, what is truth?" to. That's kind of for another day. That sort of final line of that, "and those who are of the truth hear my voice." There are people who respond positively to the truth, and there are people who respond negatively to the truth. There are people who like the light, and there are people who hate the light. And this is a thing, you will find this as you look, and as you see all of the ways in which the world is getting worse, you will see the children of the evil one. That is to say, not people literally, with this as parentage. This is an adopted parentage. Essentially people choosing their parents in a sense. But are they turning towards the light or away from the light? And you'll see that, and it is very much a thing. And why are they permitted? Well, lest in tearing them up, you also tear up the wheat. Now, and by the way, remember that a person can become of the truth later. It's possible to repent. People do, in fact, repent, possibly even late in life. And this is part of why you can't just tear them up, because they may yet repent. You don't know until a person is dead. Well, we don't know even when they're dead, but God knows, and they know. And someday we will eventually find out who is of the truth, who was the wheat after they're dead, when their life is actually complete and they have made all of their decisions. We find out then. Until then, you can't tear them up because they may well repent. Look at St. Paul, who, if you tore him up as a weed when he was Saul, would never have become St. Paul. So that's the thing. Like, why is this permitted? It is permitted to enable the good. And you see it there, it's the same answer as before. It's the same thing, but so very intelligibly. Now, one other thing I just want to mention, in understanding, like because we talk about society degrading. Society is always degrading, but it's also at the same time, because it's a temporary world and all things are coming to an end within it, making way for new things as this prologue to eternity is being put together, so that all the things that will be in eternity are becoming made and becoming what they will be in eternity. Now, one of the things you'll see, it's often described as the pendulum effect. Society goes back and forth in various ways. And what goes on is essentially that there are always, in any given time, vices that are, evils that are really easy for people to see, and evils that are much harder for them to see as evil, and virtues that are easy for people to see as good, and virtues that are much harder for them to see as good. And what tends to happen is people will focus on the virtues they can easily see, and they will tend to ignore the vices, and be very much against the evils that they can very easily see as evil. And they will sort of just let slide the excesses of the virtue they can see very clearly as good, and ignore the evils that this causes. And over time, people start to notice, as this gets worse, as they focus on the virtues and the excesses. I don't mean an excess of moral virtue, but an excess of natural virtue. And just the things, anytime you focus on a particular moral virtue, there will always be things that are easier to let slide. So if you focus very, very heavily on the familial duty, it is easy to let slide transgressions against strangers. And if you focus super heavily on being good to strangers, it's easy to let transgressions against your family slide. So there are things that are just very hard to be good about both of them at the same time. Not impossible, it is possible to be a saint, but hard, because there's, in a sense, a tension between them, and so it's much easier to be an excess in one to the other. And so when society tends to be an excess in one, eventually the evils that in that tension build up, and then people notice, and then they become eventually, as people become kind of, used to whatever, human beings get used to anything, they start noticing this, and then they start letting the previous evils slide and really, really focus on this evil. And then they focus on certain goods that are very much opposed to this evil, and they kind of let slide the goods that are in tension with these things that are hard to hold simultaneously. And so this kind of thing, this is how society bounces around. It's called the pendulum, but it's a little bit like a real pendulum, because a real pendulum doesn't go side to side, at least if it's on a string. It actually, because of the Coriolis effect, winds back and forth, and eventually, makes, really big circles. It doesn't just swing from two opposites, but keeps on veering a little bit. And it's a really good metaphor for it. Society tends to be a pendulum more like that, where it goes, really far in one direction, really far in the other, but not quite where it had been, to something different than where it had been, and then to something different again, then to something different again, then to something different again. And it's actually multivariate. It's not just on the two things. It's just a useful metaphor to sort of start off with. And so there's always degradation. People are always losing the virtues that other people had well, but at the same time, they are starting to emphasize virtues that other people didn't. Now, within that, times can be better or worse as well. When people are more philosophically correct, that works a lot better than when they are more philosophically wrong. And you can have things like, like communist dictatorships, where things are really, really terrible on a very large number of fronts. Although they're never purely evil about anything. Things, if you look, will never be permitted on a moment-by-moment, individual basis. There will still always be love and kindness and goodness in the moment. That you can do acts of goodness, you can do acts of teaching, you can do acts of compassion, you can give, food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty at least some of the time, even in these, very, very terrible times. And, that's not to say that there aren't times when, like, people's time on earth comes to an end. Everyone dies. Sometimes a lot of people die all at basically the same time. Everyone has a finite amount of time. We're all here only temporarily, because this is just getting ready for the real thing. This is getting everything ready to be in eternity. Sometimes there's less to get ready than other people have. So you have to remember, we can't measure by what we're accustomed to as if, we're the ones who are actually putting it to, doing all the work of putting it together. We are simply permitted to take part in the work of putting together what comes to eternity. That's why we're in the same time and space and so on, able to affect each other's. We're able to take part in this. Now, when I say why we're able to, I mean, this is a reason. It's not the whole reason or anything. You're never going to be able, I certainly won't be able to explain all of the reasons that God has for doing things. But you can explain one reason. You can talk about one of the things that you can identify. And as long as you don't push that into trying to think that's everything, then, you can describe that without, becoming massively in error. The moment you try to say that you understand what God's doing, you're turn around. You're going the wrong way. But anyway, okay, unless it's with a catch like love. Okay, but anyway, point being, when you look at society, when you look at things that are crumbling, they are. And they're really bad. They've always been really bad since the fall. They're a lot worse ever than you think. And this is actually a major point that helps one in dealing with them, is coming to really realize just how terrible things actually are. Because you can sort of be afraid of what's going to happen when you think things are actually fairly good and see that good things are coming to an end. When you realize, no, they're actually really terrible. They've always been terrible. They're terrible in different ways. And always throughout all of this terribleness, good is always in the work you are given in the moment. It's all the real things that you have to do. It's not in the ideas. It's not in the idea of like, oh, society helps people to be whatever. Yeah, okay, that's a generalization. That's it's not that it's false because it's a generalization, but it's an idea in your head, whereas an actual glass of water that you hand to somebody is a real thing and in the moment. A piece of knowledge that you give to somebody is a real act of teaching in the moment. And life is lived in the real, actual moments. It's not lived in our general abstractions. And a lot of fear comes from sort of living in the general abstractions, thinking, oh, things are so good in this way, or things are good in that way, and that's coming to an end and we're losing this good. And yeah, in some sense, yes. It's not false. The world's actually a hell of a lot worse than that, though. It's if you thought things were good, you're wrong. You're just very, very wrong. If you actually like really come to know and look into it and were able to see all that is hidden, you would see it's a lot worse than you thought. And that's actually very comforting, because that's not it reminds you that that's not the part to look at. It's not that it's wrong, but it's not helpful. It's not the part to look at. The part to look at is moment by moment, what is the good that you're given to do here and now in this moment? And that's where you will find happiness, is in doing the actual work of putting together reality to enter into eternity, not in worrying about general trends and abstract ideas. I mean, abstract ideas like, people encourage adultery. That's an abstract idea. It's true. Plenty of people do encourage adultery, but that's abstract. You're generalizing over a lot of people and over a lot of time. You have abstracted from all of these many particulars this pattern. And the pattern's not false, but it's also not actual. It's a pattern. It's a thought in the head, as distinct from here and now, maybe you can help this person be faithful. Here and now, you can support this person in being faithful. Here and now, you yourself can be faithful. And that's where the good is actually to be found. That's the work to be found. And that's where happiness is actually found, in the actual. Happiness is not found in the abstract. The abstract is good insofar as it helps you to get the actual correct. But the abstract is still the abstract. It's not the actual. And if you try to live in that, you'll be unhappy, because you're meant to live in the actual for a time. And then your time here will be over, and then eventually there is eternity. So that's the other thing, is to remember that everything is supposed to be temporary. If it's not temporary, you're getting it wrong. Temporary here and now is actually part of what's supposed to be going on now. All good things that are changeable must come to an end, so that they can eventually become unchangeable in the fullness of eternity, where you can have not changeable moments that are never the same thing moment to moment, but the fullness of reality all at once. That's to come later. That's not to be found here, and keeping those two separate will also really help. So that is some thoughts on the practical side of how to deal with all the evil in the world. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.